Thank you all for joining our webinar. It's Startup M&A in a Down Market. Yes, it's still happening. My name is Samantha, and I'm on the startups team here at Brex. As some of you may know, Brex has recently acquired Pri Financials to continue our mission to help every growing founder and company realize their full potential. Today, we're going to hear from Brex Chief Operating Officer, Michael Tannenbaum, and VP of M&A, Art Levy. If you've dialed in as a founder looking to understand more about M&A options available to you, or as an investor interested in our point of view as serial acquirers, or if you are just big fans of Brex, Michael, and Arthur, we've got some awesome content for you today. Without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Michael and Arthur.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Michael. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Brex. I've been here for 5 years and don't have as much M&A experience as as Art, but I started my career somewhat in M&A as well. I'll let Art introduce himself.
Yeah, so as Michael said, started my career in M&A. I've led the past 10 deals at Brex, and before that, led BD here. Both of us, we love startups. I've been involved in the startup community for about 10 years, minxing and drinksing, which is a technical term that Michael made up, but I like to use, and excited to talk to you about some of our thoughts. But first, Michael, why are we here?
Perfect. So look, I think it's super important for me to talk about just Brex and startups. We've been working with the startup community since the beginning. Brex has been, I joined when Brex was just 3 people, and a big part of the efforts that me and Art and Samantha and a lot of us have been working on in the startup space is just talking to startups about the things that we experienced as a startup, specifically about things that other people tend to shy away from just because they can be a bit awkward, which M&A is certainly in that category. But I think it's super valuable to talk about these things directly and openly and speak from the experience that we've had at Brex. And we're very committed to startups, and that's just been a part of our history since the beginning. So Art, anything you'd add there?
No, I think that sums it up. I think also as a corp dev guy, I know that corp dev can have, quote, like bad reputation in the Valley of avoiding me, not responding to emails. And I think that founders shouldn't be scared of corp dev. They should just use us like we try to use them. And today is what we're trying to do is give you an inside look on how you would do that.
Right. Some people might be avoiding you, not necessarily because you're corp dev, but.
Well, I don't believe that. As you know, I have a fancy title on LinkedIn, so I would think that most people would want to talk to me.
Understood. So look, today, one of the reasons that we're naturally talking about M&A is because it is a tougher time for tech. Right now, you've all probably seen the headlines. You're aware that startup formation and startup investment is down. I think the number one thing from my perspective here is just interest rates. I'm sure you've heard it, but worth repeating that as interest rates rise, there are other things that people can invest in that aren't tech. And so historically, when interest rates were really low, investors would have tech would be just by far outperforming and outgrowing. And that's less the case today because there's a lot of things that offer some return in a higher interest rate environment. And so what that means now is that as Art knows, in a tougher environment, people tend to think a little bit differently about optionality and about strategy. And so,
Yeah, and I think the call out here as well, Michael, is that we haven't necessarily seen M&A drop off in the same way as the rest of venture funding as on a basis of all of North American M&A, but even specifically in tech. In the last 8 months since the market started falling, we've seen public to public M&A, public to private, private to private, companies like Salesforce doing tuck-in M&A of a startup called Troops. You saw Shopify buy Deliver for $2 billion, which is not a small deal, especially given Shopify's own valuation is down 70% in the past 8 months. And you also saw a bunch of public to public deals. So I think the takeaway is that just because it's a down market and just because things are sliding doesn't mean M&A isn't happening. In the past, as we've seen this before, as Michael knows, I was a history major, and you got to learn from the past. As we've seen in the past recessions, you see large acquirers like Intuit, Microsoft, Square be opportunistic. Michael, while I was a history major, likes to to quote history, and as you say, Michael, never waste a good crisis. I believe was that Churchill?
I think that was Churchill, but now Tannenbaum. So and just to give you a sense for at least what goes on here at Brex, both during at the onset of COVID and then more recently this summer, both times when we started to see this shakeup, I went immediately to Enrique, one of our co-founders and CEOs, and I said, look, what are we going to do now, right? We reevaluated the strategic landscape, thought about competitors, thought about expansion, because that's just very natural. I think it's a catalyst for change, and so that's happening across boardrooms, executive suites, whatever. That's happening across the landscape right now as people reassess what does this environment mean for tech, and so that's where you can see that this down market, if you will, can actually be a catalyst from M&A.
So I think the next thing we wanted to do was, given this landscape, given the environment right now, we wanted to talk a little bit about a potential framework that we believe makes sense as a founder if you are even at all considering M&A. We understand, obviously, I've never been a founder. Michael, although he was employee number one, has not either. We know this is super personal, and obviously, I can only imagine what it's like, but having been on the other side, we do feel that we have a few ideas and things that we might be able to help as you think through this.
Yeah, I mean, there are, of course, I've been around founders for a long time. There's the occasional one who starts a company with the goal of selling it in exactly the right time. But for the most part, a lot of these companies are mission driven. A lot of founders are driven by a number of things, and very rarely is the dream, to sell. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's not the best outcome for the founder and for the company, for the mission, for the project, for the employees. And so I think, as we were kind of saying, this environment allows and sort of asks people to think, what is the best thing for especially the mission? How do we accelerate that the most? And sometimes that means, considering a sale. And so we'll talk about how you do that now. And so in terms of reasons to sell, I think the most obvious one, at least that we're showing here, is that the right suitor is knocking, right? So there's actually somebody interested, and that naturally makes you think about your options, which, if that's the case, of course, right? When somebody suggests this, you'd naturally think about it. I think the second one is a little bit what I was mentioning previously around the mission, which is sometimes if you have your goal and you realize that being a part of a larger company or a better funded company or a company with more top of funnel or more resources or even just more employees, more experience, all that can sometimes give you that 10x impact that you could never get just from raising the next round or hiring the next executive or pursuing the next OKR.
Yeah, and I think just to tack on to that on the first one, on the right suitors knocking, I think that on this one, the way I think about it is that a lot of founders have a few companies that they might entertain a sale for. For both Weave and Pry, the deals that Brex has done in the last 12 months, when I spoke to the founders, they said, yeah, Brex was one of a few that I would talk to. But I think this is very important because M&A can be extremely distracting. My entire job, literally my entire job, don't tell Michael, is to wine and dine founders that might even have a 1% chance of selling if Enrique and Michael tell me that, hey, we love this company. We found out our product team, we think this is the right company. I'll fly across the country just for a lunch. And by the way, in coach now, because
yes, you will coach. And
that
yes,
is very hard on me and my skin, but I do for Brex as I have. But, jokes aside, it's a personal decision. So don't get distracted unless it's like one of three people that this would be such an incredible thing to be a part of a bigger rocket ship with that suitor. And then lastly, the last two reasons, which by the way, we have on here because we think that potentially in the Valley, people don't talk about them enough. There's nothing wrong with burnout. There's nothing wrong with wanting liquidity. A lot of founders have sold at the wrong time or sold at the right time, and it makes a big difference. So really think about your personal situation and don't necessarily listen to investors and advisors who aren't in the trenches every day and who have 100 bets, whereas you're spending all your time building this one company.
Right. I mean, that's the thing is, as we said, it's personal. So there's a lot of pundits out there. People will tell you, there's me and Art telling you, but the reality is it's kind of about you and your business and your team. and what works for you. And there's a lot of examples of founders doing this, and there's plenty of examples of people going it alone. And as Art mentioned, there's examples of people, unfortunately missing the boat. And so I think we're just trying to be helpful to you and just talk you through what the framework should be as you're evaluating this, particularly in this environment, just to come back to that point. So on what type of M&A are you, or to thy own self be true?
Is know thyself, is that a Shakespeare quote? I'm not sure why it's on the page here.
Yeah, it is. And some of us have read Shakespeare, which includes me. But so I think this framework actually came as a synthesis from a number of Brex advisors. I think Brex has done a really good job. On a side note, one big credit to Enrique that's helped Art and myself is we've involved a lot of advisors who have experience, not just with M&A, but in for example, today we're talking about M&A. So folks like Nikesh Arora, who's done a lot of M&A now, is the CEO of Palo Alto Networks. He helped us think through this. And I think talent M&A is one kind of common startup form of M&A. Also can be called an acqui-hire. And the key thing to be thinking about here is just that the team is what matters most. And so it's really about the fact that this team has worked together before, knows each other, has a certain skill set. Often, we find, and Art can talk more about this, at least at Brex, oftentimes we're doing talent M&A from within fintech. But if we were looking for a security application, it might be a team that's worked on security issues for a long time. We've done some of those. And so I think the value is industry domain and experience working together, not necessarily the specific project or product or even mission that company was focused on. But that's kind of how we think through talent M&A. Anything to add, Art?
No, I think you nailed it. I think talent M&A in general, actually, I think originated from another mentor of mine, Sarah Adler, who had Dropbox and then Airbnb, I think was one of the early people who perfected this process. And I think the thing from a founder perspective is, like we said, know thyself. If you're talent M&A, you want to be pitching yourself probably as product M&A. And if you're product M&A, you want to be pitching yourself as a business M&A, and we'll get more into that later. But I think the idea is on talent, it's really you have subject matter expertise, but you just, being honest, you just don't have product market fit. And you're trying to land somewhere for whatever reason based on that. So the second type of M&A, which is the most common for successful exits of startups, is product M&A. So this is where you've reached product M&A, but you haven't yet scaled. And the reason to sell here is, honestly, you're selling the dream. You have a product, you have the beginnings, you have what I like to call green shoots. Michael, I know you're a gardener. So what I mean by that is, you're just seeing the beginnings of the plants, and
Right.
You're telling acquirers—
You have to own a house, Art, to be able to garden.
You need to be like saying, look, this is going to be a redwood tree, or in 2 years, so pay me for that because I'm 100% sure it's going to be that, and this is worth so much. And that's kind of how you want to be pitching yourself. So examples of that are, firstly, Brex and Pry. So Pry is a fantastic financial modeling tool for startups, really popular in the YC community and in the Seed Series A community. When I was speaking to them, they and I kind of knew that the cross-sell opportunity would be a slam dunk here, because it's very on point with our customers. It's a tool they need, and the culture fit seemed really great. Another relatable example would be Google's acquisition of Nest. I remember when that was done, people were really bristling at the revenue multiple, and more on how we think about product M&A valuation a bit later. But people were bristling at that, not realizing necessarily that Nest was Google saying, okay, this is hardware, it's a thermostat, but this team is going to build a bunch more hardware for us. A lot of that, by the way, Nest design team ended up doing a bunch of amazing design work for them. And so again, you have to think from the acquirer point of view. For product, you are worth more to them than you are on a standalone basis. That would be the mantra that I would give founders who are in this bucket. Over to you, MT, for P&L. I'm not sure what that is at P&L, so, but maybe you can dive in there.
Right. I just found out before this webinar that Art is actually using a Mac, so you can be sure he's not working on any business M&A because that requires Excel. And business M&A, I think the main takeaway here is it's about the P&L, right? So this is going to be larger deals, probably not super applicable to many people on this call, although we don't like to make assumptions. So this would be where the acquirer or the buyer is actually evaluating the business P&L as it fits into the broader buyer P&L. And so things that matter here a lot are public market multiples, cash flow analysis, discount rates. And so it's a more standard corporate finance approach. And some of the largest companies will use this to expand TAM. But when they do that, the constraint that they're usually looking at is traditional corporate finance metrics of like, how much does it really make sense to pay? Because a lot of times these companies are public and they have, serious boards with investors that, not that none of us don't either, but there's just the bar for doing this M&A is really high.
Makes sense. And also business M&A usually then ends up being larger because, right, like the larger you are, the more revenue you are, the more you have to justify your valuation, just like a later stage series DC.
Right. And in those processes, especially if you are public, you'll often see, and not that you may or may not be students of financial filings and SEC filings, but you'll often see like in the S4 that's printed after merger, there'll be like the board has this fiduciary duty to actually evaluate the highest bid. And so it's just a more serious process. And it's not typically what most startups are doing, but worth knowing what happens there too, as some of us get bigger.
So I think I touched on this earlier, but now we want to talk a little bit about how to sell. And I think part of how to sell is knowing, first of all, what bucket you fall into. I think a lot goes into that. I think you kind of know as a founder, if you have product market fit yet, if you have substantial revenue, how much you would add to the acquirer if they're taking you in-house and cross-selling you versus keeping you standalone. So first, know kind of where you are so you know what leverage you have. And then we want to talk about positioning. So over to you, MT.
Yeah, so I think with positioning, we talked about obviously the distraction piece. So I think you got to come into this like you would any negotiation where you've discussed, at least with the key parties. So whether that's your co-founder or key executives, your investors, you kind of want to know what you're working with when you come in, because ultimately, like any negotiation, it comes down to, your reserve price and your relative positioning versus kind of where your acquirer is. And so a lot of this is about understanding where, like any negotiation, where your counterparty and their mindset. But just to be more specific, right, it comes when you think about what type of deal you are, right? So if you are a talent M&A or an acqui-hire, you have a sense for how well your team has worked together. You may have been working together in multiple deals. You know how much money has been put into your company and what investor expectations are there. So we'll get into valuation later, but all of those things are informing your positioning. And you also know what it looks like, very frankly, for you to be standalone, right? And if you've got, and we can talk about this with Pry, right? They had a very real offer to do, I believe it was a Series A. And so like that is, and you kind of know what that path is and you're evaluating that against selling. And so all of this is sort of factoring into the positioning. I think the last part, Art, you should definitely comment on in terms of.
Yeah. I think you have to be ruthless in keeping your options open, founders. And on the last one, ensure you have warm relations at the acquirer. If you are only speaking to corp dev, the acquirer is not taking the deal seriously if you've had 3 calls. So I think that is a big takeaway, because I love myself, as you guys can probably know. I think I'm very important, but the truth is, if Brex is going to do a deal, there needs to be a product director that is very like stamping of approval, and like that, any good M&A process, that will be the case. And Enrique knows about the deal and has talked to the CEO, because we don't do deals willy-nilly. Even as we said, a serial acquirer, 10 deals in 3 years is kind of a lot. And so get your warm relationship. So if they're keeping you only to corp dev, say, look, I want to talk about product vision with someone on the team that I'm actually going to be working on, not like a fake banker like yourself. Like, you don't have to be nice to me. I'm joking, but basically really massage to get to the levels, because by the way, that will also help get your valuation as high as possible later in the process. Now, I don't mean that you want to alienate corp dev, because as a corp dev guy, we want to do deals when we think they're good, but you need to have a higher escalation point at the company.
Yep. So in terms of valuation framework, I think the way to think about this is it is more of an art, and I don't mean Art Levy here, than a science. You, especially for the talent in the product deals, the way you want to be thinking about it is, what is your value to the acquirer? That's just as much that's really what ultimately sends the price in these smaller deals versus any kind of like intrinsic or cash flow based deal. Only when we get to that third category of business M&A does it really become like, what is your intrinsic or standalone value? And then what is your value with a control premium? I think what we're talking about here is more, how much can you accelerate the company that is purchasing you? How much does you like, what is your direct impact on their P&L, but also what is your indirect P&L? How long would it take them to go out and find a team like this, build this product, hire a leader? And as anything, the larger the company, and we know this at Brex, it always takes longer and more money than you think. And so, Art, it'd probably be good for you to just talk about how we thought about this with Pry.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and then right before I do that, I would say, just piggybacking on what Michael, you said, acquirers just need to be able to justify their price, and they'll say whatever they want, frankly, to say, hey, like, we think you're worth this, and the reason for this is X, Y, and Z. As a founder, you want to actually really understand the acquirer's business, and you can do this a bit later in diligence if they're paying you in stock, in a way, say, hey, look, we want to have a session on like your business plan and where you're going, because then as a founder, you can say, okay, like, I know Brex, for example, is focusing on the Brex for Startups offering, and they have 25% market share and they want to take that double. As the founder of Pry, I knew and I know that I'm going to be valuable to the acquirer. And so, yeah, for example, at Brex, the way we thought about Pry was, hey, what is the attach rate of what will be the attach rate of this software on our Brex startup segment, both on the upsell of the, tens of thousands of customers we already have, and also on the new sale. Remembering that we already have a sales force. And so in a lot of ways, we just have to teach them how to sell Pry. And, one of my mentors, people I look up to, is the head of, now I guess the president of Twilio. He says, like, you want to buy things that your sales reps can put in the bag and sell. Because now I have the same sales rep, that same AE with the same compensation, but now he can sell a credit card, a bank account, and FP&A modeling software that all tie together really nicely. That's going to be a much easier sale than when Pry, by the way, is standalone, having to hire reps and do that whole motion. So there's this cat and mouse game where you know that you're worth more to them than you are standalone. They know that too, but they don't want to pay you what they're worth to them. You have to find somewhere in the middle that works for the board of the acquirer, the board of the startup, as well as the founder. I think the last thing I'll say, and then we're going to talk a little bit about process, is only the paranoid survive. I think founders are a bit too trusting, and I'm here to tell you, do not be trusting. Okay, stay paranoid until the money wires. You need to be planning the series A or B or whatever it is until the deal hits, because especially
sell until you close, right? That's the thing. Someone, when I worked in private equity, used to use that line. It's like, even if it feels awkward, until you have a deal, you're pursuing all deals, right?
Yeah, buyers are notorious for changing their mind. So have a contingency plan. I think, again, not to harp on Pry for Pry, but Pry used Pry software to know, okay, here's my runway, here's how much I'm selling this month. If the deal with Brex doesn't close, I need to, launch the series A within X weeks. You guys need to be doing that, because just because
don't be unethical, right? Don't lie. That's not the message, but the message is, until you have a signed deal, you don't have a deal.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways this plays out is exclusivity periods. And so don't sign up for, 120 days. You can have like 60-day exclusivity with 15-day increments that are increasing.
In transactions, time is your enemy, right?
Yeah.
Once, because it shifts as soon as, and you'll see this in any deal, right? Whether it's financing, buying a house, whatever, as soon as the buyer has decided that they want to do the deal and they've made that indication, and now the seller's kind of waiting for the money to come, that's when the buyer has the most power. And so the seller, which can be you, like, until you have your deal signed up, you have all the power. And so that's where you need to kind of really negotiate. One other thing, Arthur, that I don't think we touched on enough before we move on to process is just kind of this keeping conversations warm piece, whether it's through corp dev or partnerships. But you don't with valuation framework and just with selling in general, anything is always better if you're not showing up at someone's door saying, "Hi, I'm ready to sell right now." And so I think the value in using your partnerships team well, use your corp dev team, your strategy, whatever it is, make sure you're forming these relationships over time. And I saw some of the questions in the Q&A. So these kind of come organically and inbound, and it's not like, oh, I realized that, and some of this can also be through vendor.
You don't want to be, right? You don't want to be showing up in like, traveling salesman. You want to say, oh, like would love to do a partnership with you, because you can bait the acquirers. You say, oh, I want to do a partnership. Like, look at my great product. That's what happened with Pry. They kind of, they wanted to do a partnership. We started hearing about them, and then we went after them. It's a little bit like you got to dangle. You got to like throw out the
goods.
You don't want to be chumming the waters,
right?
Like I'm here, buy me.
Yeah.
Like
definitely, you don't. Whatever you just saw, you don't want to be doing that, right? So yes.
Let's talk about the process.
Okay, so we're not going to spend a ton of time on this because we are going to circulate, or we'll come up with a way for people to get access to this after. But usually a minimum 12-week process. So sometimes people just have unrealistic expectations. Remember, there's lawyers, there's contracts, there's documents, there's insurance. So it's not going to go faster than 12 weeks. That would be record time. So I think, but so you can sort of starting from the sourcing all the way through signing, and then pretty important to talk about integration, as we know, means like how the companies work together afterwards. That's a huge deal. And it's a whole other discussion that, we're not going to get into today, but equally important.
Totally. So I think from the battlefield, we wanted to just talk a little bit about how we do it. I think I've talked a lot about that already. I think what I would just hammer home is that understand that at scale of like, let's say 100 million in revenue plus, more and more until you're at $1 billion revenue plus as an acquirer. And for the startups to understand, not all innovation can happen within the four walls of your company. Like, I don't care how great your product team, your engineering, your go-to-market team, if you are good, are using M&A to supplement that. If you look at any $20 billion plus market cap company today, which by the way, they used to be 50, Salesforce, Twilio, Shopify are the ones that come to mind right now. They all use M&A in a highly strategic way to continue to grow, because if they didn't, shareholders would lose faith because they just can't innovate across everything. I think our board likes to say we're like building 4 planes and flying them at the same time, which we are, where Brex is executing at a tremendous scale and ability. But when you're doing that, you kind of need to have innovation that you acquire in an inorganic way. I think we wanted to, Michael, anything to add here? I think we touched a little bit on the diligence process.
Yeah, we touched on that. I think we could probably for another session, we can go through more detail on how you respond to diligence, what you put in the data room, et cetera. And then of course, integration, which integration is actually very important and often overlooked. So, but I think just in the spirit of the questions that we've gotten and the time, we should probably start taking those.
Yeah, perfect. Samantha, over to you.
Cool. I'm here. I think we need to stop sharing our screen. And then there we go. Amazing.
By the way, are you from Boston, Samantha?
Oh, yes. I've been trying to lose the accent though. I don't know what was the tell.
We all happen to be from Boston, and we're all fighting the accent as hard as we can.
Okay, you guys, that was amazing. Thank you so much. We have a lot of questions that have come in, so we're just going to jump right into it. This one came in actually ahead of the session from Chirag for both Michael and Art. How do you think about acquisition financing in a down market in terms of shares, cash, debt, et cetera?
Yeah, I can take a start. I think in general, you're looking as an owner, as a founder, you're looking for the least dilutive, but option. And you're looking to do that, of course, with minimizing risk. So debt tends to be the first place you look to if you can support it. Remember that debt is supported generally by cash flow. So if that's available, I think you start there. If not, when you're buying a company, if you have a lot of cash and you believe a lot in the future appreciation of your stock price, and you haven't raised in a while, and you know that, and you have a good sense that the mark on your shares would be higher than it is today, you're going to want to use your cash because you know that your equity is super valuable and you could go out and raise higher. At the same time, if you feel like your equity is fully valued and you just got a big new mark and valuation, you might want to use your equity there. Just remember that your counterparty is likely aware of all of these things too. And so that's the push and pull there.
I think also one thing we hadn't talked about is in any deal that we do at Brex, and talking to other corporate development leaders, there's definitely a revest period. So when you hear a headline number, part of that number is being revested over time as the acquired company employees work at Brex, let's say. And so one of the things we think about is we definitely want those folks excited about the Brex expansion story. And so we're not going to be doing all cash deals. We're not going to even be doing majority cash deals. Even if the sellers are getting some of it up front, we don't want it to just be cash that's apportioned, some today, tomorrow, in a year, in 2 years. We want them to believe, okay, Brex plus Pry is going to be 1 + 1 = 6. So I want Brex shares at today's valuation. If they say, hey, Brex is overvalued, I'm going to take the cash, we're probably not going to do that deal, because why would they work hard? Why would they want to be part of our rocket ship? And as I touched on, joint vision is incredibly important. Like Pedro and Enrique, they spend time with the CEOs going on walks, virtual, now real, to make sure that things are aligned, even for a small deal. I think that's an interesting thing, Michael. Like Enrique, Pedro, they want to know who the CEOs of our companies are buying. At 50 million, that's less than like 0.5% of our company, right? That's not traditional for companies of our scale.
Right. Totally.
Great. Thank you, guys. Next question. This one is from Ralph for Arthur. What tools are sellers using to prepare for exit readiness? And what tools are buyers using to make due diligence most effective?
So I think, great question, Ralph. So I think on the exit readiness tool, you want to make sure your house is in order, very similar to when you're running a fundraise. And so that's why a lot of times when we're approaching sellers, they're like, oh, great, like I was about to run a fundraise, now I'm considering this, and they make a decision one way or the other. So what does that mean? That means a virtual data room like Citrix or Intralinks. That means that they're using QuickBooks Online, probably. That means they have you have a bank account and credit card. Hopefully it's Brex. And then you have a really robust financial model, including understanding of your cohorts and how they're scaling. And so on that, just being honest, Pry used Pry to do that. Obviously, there are other tools out there, but they did. And that's how I evaluated the business. And that made me like it even more. Shameless plug aside. On the buyer side, I think there you have to have a very strong legal team. We have one at Brex, and we have templates of letters of intent and share purchases agreement. I think that this is a cliche, but people believe things when they're written down. So you call a founder and you say, hey, I want to buy your business for 50 million. They say, okay, great. I don't want to sell. You say, hey, there's a non-binding letter in your inbox. That changes the story. And I've seen that countless times. And to do that, you need to have a legal team that can be ready for when you have that conversation to hit them with the letter. It's a whole very calibrated, sequenced chain of events.
Great. Michael, this one's for you. Does opportunistic M&A behavior mean buyers are looking for discounts on valuations? If so, what range of valuation discounts would be reasonable?
Yeah, I think it does in some ways, in the sense that when in a time like this, it's known across the market that at least in the public markets, many companies in the high growth tech space are down over 50%. And so that's definitely, like, people are aware of that. And so I think people would look to the public markets as a place for some guidance. That said, remember, in private companies, there's a couple of things. One, there's this concept of a control premium. So the value of owning a company is higher than just the value of the company being standalone in a public market. Two, because private companies aren't marked every day, and so they have an ability to grow into their valuations. And so the last time the company raised is also a very relevant factor. So I don't think it's all about necessarily things being, quote, on the cheap. as much as it is just about the fact that as the landscape changes and people rethink things from hiring plans to investing in marketing to everything in the space, competitive landscape, it's natural that people are going to say, okay, and should I be thinking about any strategic M&A opportunities, either as a buyer or seller, given the changing dynamics? Because everything about the status quo of the business has now changed. But yes, of course, some of that is that certain things are going to be discounted, but generally everything is discounted. So the dynamics of valuation shouldn't change materially, or the terms of trade shouldn't have changed materially.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And I know while we can all agree that New England sports teams are superior, we do have Elliot asking both of you, what is one time when Michael and Art disagreed on making the call for an M&A event? What happened and what were the nuances of the M&A calls? And also, what deal at Brex did you wish you had done but didn't? Lots of questions there, but
okay,
go for it.
Do you want to start, Art?
Why don't you kick it off? Obviously, I think we want to use our discretion here on what we say, what we don't say, but we can probably high level picture.
So I think M&A of the kind that a startup at Brex does is a lot about the people. And so I think, people is not as, it's kind of more subjective. So I would say an area where Art and I have disagreed has been on some of the people that we've acquired. Not necessarily are they good or bad, but more like, where do they fit in with the team? Are they Brex value fit? Those types of questions. And those don't have obvious answers. You can't necessarily get around the room or write a document or a DACY as we do at Brex and agree. So it becomes a little bit more, even more art than science there. So I'd say that's been the type of thing that we've disagreed on. For me, in terms of deal that I wish we had done, I don't know that there is. I think if we had, there have been some players that have emerged in Brex space that serve early stage tech companies or startups. And I think early on, if we had kind of gone into one of them and say, maybe you focus on this product area and we focus on that area and bought them, that might have been something I would do with hindsight. A good example is we had, our cash product was actually an acqui-hire or talent acquisition that we did. And I think that was an example, but there might have been other things that have emerged in the space serving startup financial services that we could have purchased early on in hindsight. Art, anything you'd add there?
No, I think you nailed it. I think Michael and I both think we have very strong EQ. I don't know why he does. So I think we both think we can read people well. So there have been some moments where perhaps we've disagreed on the value. Obviously, we're usually on par with who we think is good, but the value where they would fit in. I think from a strategy perspective, it's not been as though, Art wants to acquire a cafe and Michael doesn't, for example.
Right. Yeah. That's fair.
Separate from South Park Cafe, correct?
Yes, we did. Brex
that was a subtle joke for the longtime Brex holders on the call.
Yes.
Okay, we got one more. This one is from Steve for Arthur. How transparent should we be as a company when we are just trying to keep potential buyers warm? What type of updates should we share? Revenue, cash, burn?
Yeah, so
can I just add one thing before I know not to cut you off? It's a really good question. And I tell this to a lot of founders that I invest in or advise in an angel capacity, which is, remember, your updates are marketing, right? And so the updates that you're sending to investors, those are getting forwarded whether you like it or not, right? And so so when you're sharing updates about things, just remember, if you are interested potentially in selling, people are reading those. Sorry, Art, to cut you off.
Yeah, no, that's exactly, you nailed it. I think that, Steve, great question. This is back to what I said before. You kind of have to put your line out there, but you don't want to be chumming the water. So on that, I would say you have your investor updates. If the buyers wanted to acquire you or start the conversations, they would. And so it has to be a situation where they might not know about you or know how fast you're growing. And in that case, you either would want to start a partnership with them to have them be like, oh, well, we're big and have thousands of customers and you're nothing. And then you say, well, actually, we're not nothing. Look how fast we're growing. Or you use you play some 4D chess and you use one of your investors, you talk to them about this and you say, look, I want to make sure that Shopify knows how fast I'm growing. Do you know someone on the board there? And maybe you plant them to have a conversation at, all the Minxing and Drinksing events about you, and that gets trickled back. Like Neil Mehta at Green Oak sends us a lot of really interesting opportunities that, some of them we've looked at very, very seriously. Some of them we haven't, but we love that. And I think that you guys should be using your investors in the same way.
Definitely.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two more. This one is from Matt for Art. What is the appropriate cadence in these conversations? In other words, what should the topics be in the first call? What should we ensure we ask? Should we ask product, pipeline, if larger startup, what is their exit plan, et cetera?
Yeah, great question, Matt. So from the founder perspective, the first call is going to be the acquirer saying, hey, I saw you, in coach on the other flight last week and love to chat. And usually if they're good, which we have a thought on the first call, you're telling them a little bit about, look at what Brex is doing. And as the acquirer, they're hitting on things that would be relevant to you. And then they're asking you what are you guys working on? What is your vision for the company in a few years? How are you thinking about all that? Just to suss out how you're thinking. And then you want to be throwing, what is it? Those Easter eggs, I guess is the term in gaming. My brother's a gamer,
Yes.
Out there saying, I've always wanted to scale the business to really big heights. I admire what X acquirers doing. Do not underestimate flattery. I'm very susceptible to flattery and most acquirers are. So you want to be saying that. So then they think, okay, whoa, maybe there's something there. And then by the second conversation, which should be no more than a week later, they want to be asking for a bit of information from you, at which point you say, well, what is this about? And then they might say, well, we want X data, but and then that's when you need to force them as the acquirer to give you a timeline. As we've been saying again and again in the last 45 minutes, harping, you might say, this is a huge distraction. And acquirers don't have a timeline, right? All they have is corp dev has they go from luncheon to luncheon. So you need to tell them, hey, I'm running a fundraise. If you want to talk about M&A, I need to know within 2 weeks, what do you need from me? Blah, blah, blah. You keep them on a cadence where you want to be talking once or twice a week. Time kills all deals. You want to keep the momentum going if you're a seller. Now, if you're not a seller, then you bat them away until they come back with some ridiculous price.
So just to finish the last question, which is related to what Art's saying, I think the way that you can keep this from being a distraction, if you're more of a operator like myself, the best thing to do is to embed corp dev, and Art alluded to this at one point, embed corp dev within the product teams, agree on the priorities in advance. And so you have the priorities for product that we're looking to with M&A. And then of course, there's always going to be opportunistic things. And that's always going to be about, someone like myself having a conversation with the founders to make sure that it's worth spending time on. But you have to be a gatekeeper and you have to pre-agree on priorities, or otherwise everything sounds good in isolation.
And as when to hire corp dev, I've been self-deprecating a lot on the call, but it is useful if you have corp dev, as Michael said, embedded in your product org. I know all of the product directors at Brex very well. I text with all of them. They send me ideas. I ask them, what are you doing on this? Have you thought about this? You want that relationship because they want me as a cat in the catbird seat, looking around and throwing ideas their way. Even if they don't like them, that just gives them a huge amount of sourcing to be again, it's not whether your product team could build this. It's if we bought Pry, what would the startup EPD team work on next to mean that we now have a much better offering going into 2023 rather than just having financial modeling software. That's the way you want your corp dev team and your EPD team interact.
Definitely.
Amazing. And so relevant to our audience of startup founders and investors and Brex fans. Thank you all. We are out of time for today. Michael and Arthur, outstanding as always. Thank you all for tuning in. We will send out the recording in a timely manner. And if you have any questions that didn't get answered today, you can send them over to Samantha at Brex and we'll get them handled.
Thank
Cool.
you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you all.